Good afternoon, people. You are now tuned in to Urban Voices Radio. I am your host, Brad Harrison. I got my main man, Sean Mucker, in the building. What up, Sean?
What's going down?
He's golded out today with his Boston Red Sox hat on.
I'm good.
What's going on, people? We have a couple special guests in the building today. We have my man, Damon Cobble. And we have my man, Trinidad. I keep wanting to say Trinidad James. He got it in here. Trinidad Jackson.
We're going to leave that Trinidad with his horrible dude with his Boston hat on. I'm from St. Louis, so you already know what that is.
Are you from St. Louis?
That Boston.
We got Music Soul Child in the building.
Hey, but listen, Mr. Cobble's a very, very special guest. Somebody I've been wanting to connect with for a while. I've been watching this movement, man. And when people make a movement in the city, it doesn't go unnoticed. And I've noticed this man making trends throughout Louisville, Kentucky when it comes to mental health, particularly when the mental health involves African-American males. Because I kind of have a passion for that as well, because I feel that a lot of African-American males, and no disrespect to the military, Sean's an ex-vet, but no disrespect to the military, but I think a lot of black males that come from some of these urban communities suffer some form of PTSD that's not addressed, because many of us grow up, we experience death at an early age, we experience violence at an early age, we experience a lot of things that may seem normal to the average inner city youth, but probably is not normal when it pertains to mental health. So, Mr. Cobble, I know you were deputy sheriff for 13 years, and you put that career behind you, and now you are pursuing a career in therapy and mental health. And I think the focus is marriage and family therapy, but you have a kind of focus on mental health for African American males. Is that correct?
Well, let me know that's not actually totally correct. I want to give some clarity. The Minority Mental Health Project the aims of this project is to address gaps in the research, affordability, accessibility, and cultural responsibility. Now, the program that we're having on the 21st is one of our first initiatives to address the gaps in the research. It just so happened it's a male event.
Okay.
But understand that the Minority Mental Health Project is address the gaps in the research that's going to entail everyone across the spectrum who's underserved.
Okay, so it's not just males, it's
Correct.
Everyone across the
Correct.
spectrum.
Underserved minorities.
Underserved minorities.
Correct.
Okay, so what brought your interest from Sheriff's Department to mental health?
Well, you have to go back to the 70s and 80s. I grew up in Southwick. Shout out to Southwick.
Shout out Southwick.
My upbringing was very, very dysfunctional. I love my mother. She did a great, wonderful job with myself and two siblings. But in hindsight, looking back, I didn't realize until I was like 31 how dysfunction my upbringing was and how it impacted me personally in terms of my decision making, in terms of my functionality in relationships, in terms of how I viewed life. And so, that kind of pushed me to go seek some help and get some guidance and try to address these issues that I'm struggling with internally.
Okay, now when you say dysfunction, and we all, like I say myself, for me, maybe around 31, 32, dysfunction was a norm. So when you say dysfunction, what particulars would you describe to? What particulars would you address to describe dysfunction in the African American community?
Well, from my personal experience, I can say domestic violence that impacted me growing up in a community inundated with drugs and gangs that was normalized. So those points in itself really impacted me in a negative way. But I just flipped it around and try to make it into a positive experience, a learning experience, and try to use that to impact change in the space that God has blessed me in.
All right, let's dig into that a little bit. Do you think domestic violence is something that takes place in the African American community that's kind of unsaid? It's kind of I don't want to say a secret, but it's, in our community we have this thing now, there's no snitching, there's no call the police. So do you think domestic violence is one of those things that happens in our community that has been normalized but hasn't been addressed because we don't actually admit that it's a problem?
Well, I think a lot of people don't admit it because they don't understand that it is a problem. They don't know it is a problem. They have normalized it. That's our everyday function growing up, looking at the street fights, looking at, single family households. I mean, but you also, to put it in context, you have to go back to the historically too, in terms of, slavery. We know when, families were intentionally broken up or separated. That right there is what laid the foundation that I think that has compounded the black family system.
Look, you hit on a lot of points.
But also, I just want to reiterate that, heck, domestic violence and a lot of violence goes on in the community. But, when you're a black man, it's not safe to call the police now. It wasn't safe to call the police then. I think it's a lot worse then than it is now because, people videotaping it now.
Or is it?
It might. Well, I say it probably ain't changed, but what I'm saying is that it's being more recognized now.
Right.
So if you call the police, there's a possibility that male might not make it back home.
Yeah.
So I think it's one of the reasons why it's probably not addressed as much as it needs to be.
Right. Well, see, look, on both fronts, look, we share a lot of similar views on that because I've always felt that when you go back to slavery and you go back to Jim Crow and you go back to the Civil Rights era, you have a history in America where African Americans have experienced trauma, and a lot of that trauma was brutal. So when you have the slavery concept and you have us being submitted to massive beatings, and then you have the Jim Crow era, you have the Civil Rights era where the beating is normal in our communities, right? So I kind of relate that to the domestic violence syndrome. So in domestic violence syndrome, they say that if you're a child that grows up in a household where domestic violence takes place, one or two things are likely to happen. Either you will become an abuser or you'll totally go the opposite direction, right? But what happens to, you have a history of black people in this country that have been raised on violence. So when slavery was over and we got past the Civil Rights era, there was no therapy for black people. Black people have endured all this trauma, all this abuse for years, and then it's like, okay, well, a law is written and we're so-called set free. But there was nothing done to nourish the mental trauma that we experienced, so that until that passed on from generation to generation to generation. So now we become accustomed to violence when violence probably isn't the correct answer for a lot of issues that we face.
So I want to back up to something that you said at the outset of this interview. So you looked at him and you said, no disrespect to the military, but I think as black men we suffer trauma, right? Paraphrasing what you said.
Right.
So why'd you say no disrespect to the military? and acknowledging the trauma that we as a black community or black people face.
Well, no disrespect to black people that have served in the military in terms of fighting for this country. A lot of times when we fought for this country, we weren't actually treated as equals. But there are black people that have fought for this country that I don't want to disrespect. But I understand what you're saying, the military system as a whole, but to not disrespect those that have served in the military.
Yeah, and so I think, that's an interesting alignment because our safety, our mental health is always, has to have a comparison when it comes to popular narrative. And so for me, I don't really give a damn what other system or what other population we're looking at if we're simply looking at what we've been subjugated to, which is everything that you named, right? Dehumanization through everything from legal lynchings to being enslaved, right? 400 years just in this country of captivity. There is trauma. So whether we compare that to the military or whether we compare that to other demographic groups, we have to acknowledge our singular trauma that exists within us.
Yeah,
to dig into it authentically and genuinely versus if we're consistently comparing it to the level of traumas that other demographic groups experience or that other systems facilitate. And so Coming into your question that you mentioned, damn, I forgot. What did you lead up to?
I led up to that. In this country, we've been subject to centuries of abuse, and that abuse has become normal in our communities and has led to an acceptance of violence or dysfunction in the way we behave now.
There we go. And so it's also, critical for us to just, again, I'm using 1619 just because that's when, the first enslaved humans arrived. But clearly we have history that goes beyond that. But in this country for these 400 years, it's always been, whether it's the dominant culture or the culture that has created these systems, we've always been treated as subhuman. And so I think that has to be the starting point when we look at how we're treated, whether we're talking about looking at the healthcare system, the food system, the entertainment system, the justice system, right? When we talk about policing just in this country, for example, police departments are rooted in departments that were initially created to catch slaves, right? So to catch slaves and to terrorize indigenous communities. Those are the roots of the modern day police departments. So when we look at what just happened with Tatiana Jefferson, when we look at Mike Brown, when we look at Eric Gardner, the list goes on, right? And it's just visible because we have the social media capacity to project that to society. But like as you stated, this shit has been normalized, right? So, what's that? Oh, my bad. but yeah, so I think we have, that can't be elephants in the room. Black people can't engage in respectability politics when it comes to our liberation, when it comes to our freedom. And the more that we engage in that, the more that we oppress ourselves, the more that we will continue to sit in systems that do nothing but dehumanize us. So,
and you see why I recruited this brother to be on my board. And just for the record, Trinidad is a board member of the Minority Mental Health Project.
Okay.
And as you can see, this is exactly why I think, his voice is powerful. His voice demands attention. And, and I think that we're looking to do some great things, under this project.
Okay, so let's speak in terms of systems. So we have these different systems, one being the criminal justice system that we know is historically unfair and inconsistent when it comes to African Americans as opposed to any other demographic. So you have that, right? How do all these different systems affect the mental health of African Americans as a whole?
Now, before I just want to jump in briefly, because the systems was never established for us. So, you know what I'm saying, we not considered part of the governing body that the system supposed to cover. So a lot of time, it's a lot of trauma. Like I said, it's one thing to be, it's a lot of trauma because, it's two different, it seems like it's two different types of laws. Mm-hmm. You can see, statistically, you can see that, other races, opposed to black races, the crime, the sentencing, everything is a lot different, and it could be the same crime. So I think it has a lot to do with a lot of trauma. You see a lot of people getting exonerated because they go back and realize that person didn't commit that crime.
But specifically from a mental health standpoint, how does that affect our communities and then how we deal with each other?
Well, let's look at clinically. You have in the United States, over 85% of clinicians in America are Caucasian, and only about 4% are African American. I believe less than 4% are black men. And so you speaking of impacting something greater than the individual, and that's where this project is going to come in. We're looking to impact policy, but in terms of systems, when treating African American families, we're going to defer. What I run into is one of the first things that our families think about is, okay, don't call CBS. Are you going to call CBS if I open up to you? It's a trust issue.
Right.
And so with 85%, 84% of clinicians being a Caucasian, we don't trust the system to really treat us the way that we need to be treated. And furthermore, the system doesn't understand us historically, or they don't take that historic context into consideration.